There's an old quote from Marcus Aurelius. I may be misusing the quote. I may be overusing the quote, but I'm using it. Marcus Aurelius says that when we're engaged in debates about philosophy, we are not competing for a prize of an ordinary kind. We're competing for whether we are to be sane or insane. And I do think it's meaningful to engage in debates about political philosophy within veganism, in part because we're really questioning whether or not our beliefs, whether or not the systems of thought we're espousing, whether or not the lines of reasoning we're presenting people with make us appear to be insane or insane in terms of how others perceive us, and also, frankly, whether or not we're presenting a system of values within which we might drive ourselves insane. Are we advancing arguments that are so incoherent, so self-contradictory, that we might, if we're really being honest, be driving ourselves crazy with them? And both in private and in public, those are questions a lot of vegans ask themselves, especially if they dig in deeply to any one particular issue.
And the thing is, you've got to remember that black people and women used to be oppressed like we oppress animals today. They used to be viewed as less than, and that's exactly how we view animals. We view them as less than humans, like we used to view black people as less than white people or women less than men. It's the same idea, and it's very, very convenient to be the oppressor and to judge those who are speaking on behalf of the victims, because you're the oppressor and you like the position you're in the position of privilege and the position of power. So when people try and take that away from you by saying, hang on, maybe you're not as important as you first thought you were.
I think the most fundamental part of Earthling Ed's approach is what he says second, not first here, where he suggests that the objectives of veganism are to eliminate any barrier of more than versus less than in the relations of human versus animals. And I actually object to that. I don't accept his assumptions here. I don't accept the logic of his argument. I don't think this is a meaningful way to present veganism to outsiders. I don't think it's a meaningful way to practice veganism in your own life. If you really say that you want to eliminate the distinction of better than and less than that separates humans from animals, what does that mean for the cockroaches in your life? What does that mean for the bed bugs that may infest your apartment? What does that mean for bees and mosquitoes? Guys, what does it mean for chickens? Whether you're talking about chickens that are on a farm or chickens that are in a sanctuary or chickens that are actually living in the wilderness, in the wild. What I want for chickens, cows, and pigs, whether they're currently in cages, currently in sanctuaries, or actually living in the wild, talking about pigs as wild boars, if they're actually living that quality of life, living a life with dignity and a death with dignity out in the wilderness, not as human pets, not as human playthings, but as independent from human beings. I can describe that in terms of their independence from people, and I can also describe it in terms of their dependence upon us. Because whether an animal is on a farm, in a sanctuary, or in the wilderness, the reality is they rely on human beings, whether it's the human beings that are literally feeding them, on a sanctuary, feeding them, providing them with veterinary care and so on, or if it's just the human beings who organize and manage the wildlife preservation area, the national park, whatever it might be where these animals are living. It's fundamentally absurd and incoherent for Earthling Ed to describe the objectives of the vegan movement in terms of eliminating any barrier of less than. That's his word. That's not my objective in the vegan movement. My objectives are attainable. My objectives are neither equal rights for animals nor equal opportunity. Phrasing this in terms of privilege and power, eliminating unequal privilege and power. Are you really claiming that there's going to come a day in the future when human beings do not have privilege over cockroaches? When human beings do not have privilege and power over bears in the wild or pigs in any of those three phases? Pigs on a farm, pigs in a sanctuary, pigs in the wilderness. You really think you can eliminate the distinction of privilege and power between a human being and a wild boar, or a human being and a pig that you may have rescued from a farm but is now dependent on human care in a sanctuary to live out its last days because some vegans managed to take it away from a slaughterhouse, which happens? Really? You think the objective of what we're doing here, this whole movement, or the particular people running that sanctuary, or the people who are working in managing and operating a national park, conservation area, you think any of them are working towards eliminating the human privilege? No. This is about human beings making better use of the privilege and power that they have, and a privilege and power that we are always going to have. An absolute inequality, and yes, an absolute responsibility that human beings have towards animals, and that I think human beings have towards ecosystems, towards the wilderness as a concept. That's something we do, in effect, have to preserve and have to manage. But ineluctably, we're going to be managing those things for our own benefit, even if we are also doing them in order to, keep biodiversity alive so that animals can enjoy their own lives to some extent independently in the wild. Ultimately, they're human values that we're imposing onto animals. It's not a question of the animals having inalienable equal rights that we have to just let them exercise. If you let a pig out of the slaughterhouse, what are the rights that pig can exercise on its own? The answer is none. The pig goes from one situation of total dependency on human beings to another situation of total dependency on human beings. The question is whether the human beings are using their power and privilege to exploit and kill that pig for a profit or for some other better goal, whether it's a wild boar in the forest or a pig being helped on a sanctuary.
Hey, I'm really sorry to bother you. Would you be interested in taking a flyer? It's about your jacket, because you may not be aware, but it uses dog fur on the trim. So the trim comes from a coyote, which comes from a species of dog. And what happens is they get caught in these leg hold traps, and sometimes they're in there for about 72 hours before the hunter comes to get them. But a lot of these coyotes are mothers, so what happens is their cubs are left alone at home, and they either get killed by predators or they starve to death.
Okay.
Are you aware that the fur trim on your coat's real dog fur? Did you ask that permission of the coyote if you could kill it?
He didn't. He's
Well,
not.
I'll tell you what. Why don't you fuck off, man?
Why do I need to fuck off?
Why are you here?
I'm just asking a question. Because I was
you
interested
don't come
to
up
know.
to me and tell me about what I can wear and what I
And what
can't
about the
wear.
animal? Why did you tell it whether it
Doesn't
could
matter
die
about
or
what I
not?
can wear and what I can't. It's none of your business.
What about the animal, though? Is it the business of the animal?
Are we advancing arguments that are so incoherent that we might, if we're really being honest, be driving ourselves crazy with them? Look at, for example, the abolitionist arguments against single-issue causes. So in this video, I'm debating with a guy named Earthling Ed, and he's aware of the critique of his position coming from the abolitionists. The abolitionists claim that it's really immoral to address fur in particular, to try to encourage people to stop wearing fur coats. And they have this very complex and, to my mind, somewhat incoherent and irrational argument as to why addressing any single-issue cause, such as fur, actually is very negative for veganism as a movement on the whole. And I've seen Ed's response to that, and I think Ed's response is quite meaningful and well-intentioned. I think he does address that quite well. Among other things, Ed just says that actually protesting against fur, it's related to veganism, but it's not the same as veganism, and you have to evaluate in a separate way. I think he has a very intelligent set of reasons he sets out for why he personally engages in protests against fur while also being a part of the vegan movement. But that position, the abolitionist position that opposes all single-issue causes, I've made videos really raising the question, well, look, if we really believe this, if we really espouse this and we really live by it, is this sane or insane? Why would it be vegan to oppose saving a particular species of dolphins in a particular river? That's a single-issue cause. The abolitionists, if they really believe what they're preaching, they would have to say, no, you're assuming that dolphins are cute and therefore they ought to have more rights or more attention from human beings. This is a form of implicit speciesism and you're only affirming oppression, blah, blah, blah. The abolitionists, the same way they oppose anti-fur protests, would oppose a positive ecological charity organization trying to save a particular species of dolphin in a particular river, trying to save them from extinction, because they're opposed to all single-issue causes. And that is, to my mind, crazy. And broadly speaking, this is one of the reasons why I engage in critique of this kind, meaningful discussion of political philosophy within veganism. For one thing in general, steel sharpens steel. We all become sharper by engaging in these kinds of examinations of what we believe, why we believe it, etc. And also, I think there really is this meaningful question of, have we let incoherent and contradictory assumptions creep into our line of thinking that might, in fact, bring us closer to insanity than sanity, even though we are all supporting and pursuing this good cause that everyone watching this video probably agrees is a good cause, veganism as an end goal, a vegan society, a vegan world, however you want to think of it. We're just a handful of individuals becoming vegan one at a time and supporting positive political and social change. And yet it's so easy. It's so easy for a popular term like social justice to creep its way into the discourse and actually really distort how we think about veganism, how we present veganism, how we pursue and propound veganism. So Earthling Ed has a video in which he addresses the misconception that vegans are forcing their beliefs on others. Whether or not it's a misconception is debatable.
Hey guys, so I just wanted to do a quick video today discussing the idea of forcing beliefs. As vegans, we're always told that we're pushing our beliefs onto others, and I'm not really sure if this is a criticism at all. And I think a good place to start with this is to view social justice movements in the past. If we look at the Black rights movement, they forced their beliefs of equality onto racists. And if we look at the suffragettes movement or the feminist movement, they forced their views of gender equality on misogynists. So to claim that it's negative to force your beliefs onto others is incredibly misguided, because if social justice movements did not do this, if they didn't make their needs heard or their beliefs heard, then they would never achieve their goals. It's by forcing your views on others that real social change can be enacted, because if you didn't do so, then nothing would ever change.
Right off the bat, Earthling Ed is assuming that veganism is a social justice movement. I have a video that is simply titled, "Veganism is not a social justice movement." So that is not an assumption I share with him. I would challenge that assumption. I have challenged in the past. But on the basis of this assumption, Ed then answers the objection that vegans force their beliefs on others by claiming that vegans only do so in the same sense in which any and every social justice movement must do so. And he gives what he thinks are flattering examples of the struggle for black rights, i.e. equal rights for black people, really meaning African Americans in the United States. I don't think he's talking about South Africa. Maybe he is. But this sounds like he's alluding to the history of the United States of America. And equal rights for women, women's equality. Now, already we have actually a very fundamental problem here, which is the failure to recognize the meaning of the term social justice. Social justice means distributive justice. And actually, the history of the struggle for black rights in the United States did not aim at distributive justice or redistributive justice. It did not aim at social justice, and it also did not achieve social justice. This video would be even longer than it already is if I dealt more deeply with the definition of social justice. It is true that social justice is more specific than distributive justice or redistributive justice. Most people complain that the term is still not specific enough. However, if you had a social movement that was, for example, aimed at taking away land from men and giving it to women, redistributing land ownership, that might be described as a social justice movement for women, as trying to achieve social justice for women, that women ought to own as much land as men. It should be very obvious to you that equal opportunity for women, the equal right to vote for women, or equal access to education for women, those things are not social justice issues by the strict definition of the term. Black rights in the United States of America tried to achieve equal opportunity. And of all the paradigms to compare to veganism, equal opportunity is especially difficult to relate to the conditions of animals, especially talking about factory farming, which is the main thing we're talking about here. It's also completely meaningless to try to apply the concept of equal opportunity to animals living in the wild, in a national park, in a habitat conservation area. What does equal opportunity mean to a bear in the forest or to a cow living in a concrete shed? It means nothing. It's completely meaningless. And there are some people, including Friedrich von Hayek, who would claim that social justice itself is a meaningless concept. It's an interesting debate to have. I don't think it's meaningless. I think we have to recognize its particular and specific meaning. And in the same sense that equal opportunity is just a concept that doesn't apply to animals in these cases. in the same way, we have to recognize that social justice doesn't apply to animals in these ways. The people who support domesticated pets and who care a lot about legal rights for dogs and cats, that's a movement within veganism. We don't talk about that much on this channel. It's called the citizenship approach. So, for example, those people want to see laws passed so that if a poor family owns a dog or cat and they can't afford surgery, then the government will, in effect, provide health care for this dog or pet so that they don't have to just kill the animal, they don't have to put it down. They feel it's against the rights of the animal to just be killed for the convenience of the family that owns the pet, or to be killed because of the poverty of the family that owns the pet. So it's a very straightforward concept. But nevertheless, we can't actually describe this in terms of equal opportunity or social justice. It's not social justice for a dog or a cat that has had its testicles chopped off, may have had its claws pulled out of its palms, may have had its teeth removed, may have had all these surgical modifications made to its body so that it just lives like a toy for human entertainment. There's no sense of social justice in then providing that animal with yet more surgeries to extend the animal's life, extend its status of perpetual dependency living on this family's carpet. That's not equality, that's not equal opportunity, that's not social justice. And it may nevertheless be a question worth asking. If poor people own dogs and cats, and then those dogs and cats need expensive surgeries, legally, what is the responsibility of the taxpayer? You tell me. So it is not so easy to invoke the name of black rights, civil rights for African Americans, and to say, well, they forced their beliefs on others, which is exactly what Earthling Ed claims here. Therefore, it's okay for vegans to force their beliefs on others. It's actually tremendously meaningful to recognize that we're talking about the United States of America. In the United States, the government did not force these beliefs on others. It remained your civil right in the United States to believe whatever you want to believe. Those movements did not seek to create uniformity of belief in America, and they did not even seek to deprive, for example, a Christian preacher of the freedom to say racist things, which they continued saying. There are still to this day white churches in America that preach against black people, and there are, although more rarely, you can see examples of racist black churches that preach against white people in America and preach that white people are the devil. They very much have freedom of expression to voice those opinions, freedom of belief, and even the freedom to organize those racist views into formal churches and political parties. So again, Earthling Ed is British. He may not understand this. He may not appreciate the significance of this. But the civil rights movement, black rights, equal rights for African Americans, never aimed at forcing their beliefs on others. And the United States, because of their constitutional tradition, it actually very much preserved the freedom of belief for people. Still to this day in the United States, it is legal to have a whites-only church or a blacks-only church, and you can see that all over America. And the things that the preachers are preaching inside those churches, whether they're Christian or some other religion, or they're a New Age cult or what have you, may indeed be racist. They have freedom of opinion, which includes freedom of racism, and freedom of belief. Okay? So black rights did not try to change people's beliefs. They tried to change government policy. And what are those policy changes aimed at? They're aimed at equal opportunity. So what really mattered for civil rights in the United States, for example, yes, there's an obvious question. Can black people actually vote? And there were a number of hurdles and obstacles and changes that had to be made because in many parts of the United States, in theory, black people had the right to vote, but in practice, they couldn't really make it happen. There had been unfair obstacles created to their exercising that right. But much trickier were things like looking at, did black people and white people actually have an equal ability to get a bank loan in order to buy a house or to build a new house? How do you legislate racism out of the banking system so that people truly have equal opportunity? How do you legislate racism out of the hiring process at large institutions so that black people and white people truly have equal opportunity? How do you amend and revise an education system, which in the United States had been built on segregation, had been built on elitism, including openly a racist elitism? How do you change that education system so that black people and white people have equal opportunity? The results were imperfect, but they were dramatically better in the 1990s than they were in the 1940s. Tremendous change, not aimed at forcing beliefs. It's not about belief. It was about equal opportunity. And if you're really honest with yourself and you really care about being consistent, just think open to the meaning of these words and what they would mean in your own life if you believed in them and practiced them consistently. I think you have to admit to yourself that equal opportunity is completely meaningless in reference to a pig that's awaiting slaughter in a slaughterhouse. If we rescue that pig, we can't grant it equal opportunity. We can't grant it equal rights. The best thing we can probably do for that pig right now in 2017 is either put it in a sanctuary or try to rehabilitate it to some extent and introduce it back into the wild. If that pig can, to some extent, enjoy its life as a wild boar would, if it can be rehabilitated, retrained, and have some kind of positive life. But no matter which way you look at it, a pig that's eaten all of its food out of a human hand is not in a position to exercise equal rights. It's meaningless. It's meaningless whether we're talking about the wilderness, or we're talking about a farm, or we're talking about pets living their whole lives on the rock. There are plenty of positive things about Earthling Ed, his approach to activism, and his YouTube channel. And above all else, he does have the redeeming quality of keeping it real. Because he's honest with his audience, he's honest about the shortcomings of his approach to activism, he's honest about when it goes wrong, when it just doesn't accomplish much, when he has these conversations with strangers that don't really go anywhere. I think we all can kind of learn from his experience and learn from his mistakes as they unfold on screen. He has been doing this for about 1.5 years, his current approach to veganism, and I think he probably will adapt and take on new methods, new angles in the years ahead. So for all that, I kind of congratulate him and I appreciate him and I wish him the best. And I think whether viewers are just looking at it as entertainment or really looking at it and questioning in their own lives what they can do, what does effective activism mean to them, a lot more good comes out of it than harm. With that having been said, I really do find that watching his videos is yet another reminder how some of these simple assumptions can lead to false and counterproductive and even insane beliefs within veganism. It may seem so simple and so appealing to argue that the objective of veganism is a crusade against privilege, but it's not. It does not make sense to present or pursue veganism as the abolition of human privilege. That is simply insane. Human beings are now privileged when contrast to a bear in the wild. I want us to use that privilege to have practices of wildlife, habitat, management, conservation that respect the bears, their dignity in life and their dignity in death, and prevent them from going extinct, that manage their numbers when they get too low or when they get too high, overpopulation, underpopulation. If there's a plague that breaks out in the forest, I do not see any sense in which I can imagine the future of this planet as one in which human beings have no privilege when they're compared to bears, or no privilege when they're compared to cows, or no privilege when they're compared to pigs, let alone cockroaches, mosquitoes, and bedbugs. That is simply crazy. And thinking of our objectives that way, thinking of our means that way, and then offering it as a justification for the shortcomings in our approaches. When people say, well, aren't you imposing your beliefs on others? I don't think it's a meaningful or rational or fair comeback to say, well, we're a social justice movement. And that's partly because I don't believe that we are. If you sit down and really think in a meaningful way about what social justice means, what it means for us, and what it would mean for the animals. And apart from that, it's not really sincerely grappling with the issue. Earthling Ed chooses flattering examples. He says, what about black rights, civil rights, women's rights? Well, what about the history of the Catholic Church? What about the history of Islam? What about the history of forcing your beliefs on others, conversion by the sword? What about really examining what people mean when they talk about forcing your beliefs on others, and why it is such a dangerous thing in human political history, whether we're talking about communism or conservative Islam across the board. Why don't we take that seriously? Why don't we show a sincere interest in examining what's wrong in our own movements and learning from the history of other movements, instead of dismissing it with this sort of cynical ploy of saying, well, what about women's rights? What about black rights? Struggles that we are ourselves, I think, Ed, we can say we are ourselves not experts in, that we're not sincerely examining in terms of the very little bit they have in common with veganism and how much they don't have in common with veganism. Ultimately, emancipation of black people in the United States relied on a civil war. And nobody in veganism is talking about having a civil war. The differences are much more meaningful and of a much greater magnitude than the similarities. But a simple, subtle idea of this kind. Social justice inserts itself early on into how we think about veganism, and then it leads to conclusions that veganism is somehow an attempt to get rid of the distinctions of greater than and less than, that it's a mission to abolish privilege, and that human beings, as Ed says himself, he claims that human beings feel guilty because they're in this position of power and privilege that must end. Ed, the power and privilege we have over animals is never going to end. And you and I as vegans are never going to stop eating bread and beans, vegetables that are produced, if we're keeping it all the way real, every day by killing animals. Gophers, groundhogs. There's a huge array of insect and mammal life that we kill every day, whether it's on a fruit farm, on a wheat farm, or on a bean farm, or what have you. If we really believe that the vegan movement was, as you describe it, an attempt to abolish the privilege, the superiority that human beings exercise over animals, I think we would be insane. And on the contrary, if we look at it as a more responsible use of that power of privilege, of facing up to the moral responsibility that's incumbent on us to do the best we can with that privilege, and to stop thinking in terms of short-term self-gratification, or just clinging on to really a bunch of cultural customs that are now obsolete, then how we think about veganism, how we practice it in our own lives changes, how we present it to others changes, and yeah, I think in a really meaningful sense, the future of the movement changes too.
À-bas-le-ciel.